Well, hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode in the road to somewhere. And if you're just joining us, we're on an epic journey, you might say. We're heading down Route 66, making 66 stops to film little videos. This is part of my book, The Road to Somewhere. And at each of those videos then is tied into a book of the Bible. And we're in our seventh season now, actually. And we're going across the state of Arizona. And in Arizona, we're going to be making, I think it's 13 stops because we're going to be going through the letters of the Apostle Paul that make up just about half of the New Testament. So, again, we are in episode 3 of this seventh season, and the seasons each are kind of like a leg of the journey down Route 66. And this on this particular episode, we're going to be heading out of Winslow, Arizona, where we were in our last episode. And of course, Winslow, famous for the way that the Eagles song made the one corner in Winslow, Arizona, maybe the most famous corner in America. And having looked at Winslow, the book of the Bible that was attached to it was First Corinthians. And so now, as we head down the road, and we're going to be, again, leaving Winslow. And ultimately, where we're going to end up here is we're going to be over in what's called Two Guns, Arizona. A couple of things about this little part of the journey. One is there's also another little town there that is called Twin Arrows. And along the way between Winslow, Arizona and Two Guns, we also go by Meteor Crater. And so we'll take a little bit of a look at that also. But these were kind of Two Guns and Twin Arrows were relatively, small towns along the way. And again, this is Meteor Crater, which you probably can't tell from just the picture alone. This is about 50,000 years old when a meteor hit this area. Actually, we were told that prior to the meteor that this was probably a heavily forested area and was occupied by woolly mammoths. And of course, the meteor strike kind of devastated everything in the area. That crater is actually a mile across, and I think it's about 3 to 4 miles around and 50 feet deep there. But on their journey, what happens is that John and Joy decide, well, let's make a stop while we're on our way to our next town that will be part of where we're going to shoot a video. And actually, they John kind of suggests, well, why don't we shoot it here at Meteor Crater? And Joy has another idea because she knows a little bit about these upcoming towns. Again, they at one point in time were just kind of normal small towns, and what has happened is that both of those, like many towns along Route 66, when Interstate 40 bypassed them, ended up becoming ghost towns. And so what you'll see here is that this is Two Guns, and this is where Joy wants to shoot the video. She just wants John kind of standing there by the post so that in the kind of back left-hand side, you see a water tower with a cowboy painted on it. And actually, the building that you see sort of in the center and back there is all that's really left. And it's vacant, obviously, but all that's really left of this town of Two Guns. So they begin to shoot the video, And as is true in many of the videos along the way, John will begin by giving a little bit of a background. He actually is going to talk a little bit about Meteor Crater also, so that probably the slide that you've seen would be part of their video. And he gives a little bit of background about how it was, 50,000 years ago, and a little bit about how it was so devastating. Then he kind of shifts over and talks a little bit about how they've decided to shoot this video in two guns. And, it's kind of a contrast to some of the cool spots along Route 66, like Winslow, Arizona, kind of famous and cool because of the Eagles. But again, Joy felt like it would be important to kind of also tie in some of these towns that have become ghost towns. And they've got this kind of beat up old welcome sign there that you see in the picture. And and so they set it up, and again, John, gives a little bit of background about how this was. I don't know if you'd call it a thriving town, but at least about how it was a town that has now become a ghost town. It was a stop, kind of a frequent stop, actually back in the 40s, because behind some of the buildings, particularly one of the gas stations that was there, they actually had a little zoo for kids, that the kids could go and kind of play around in the zoo while the parents were getting their vehicles, gassed up. So John gives again, a little bit of a background on two guns, and then he segues into the biblical book that is attached to this particular location, and that's the book of Second Corinthians. Now, this sounds probably relatively obvious, but the primary purpose of the book of Second Corinthians was that it was to be a follow-up. Oh, by the way, this shows you a little bit down the road. Oh, and I wanted to also show you that somebody has kind of penciled in or painted in there that you're actually not welcome here in Two Guns, but the biblical book again, Second Corinthians, and the primary purpose of Second Corinthians is that it's a follow-up to First Corinthians. By the way, I'm going to do a little bit more on this book than what is in my book that we're following, The Road to Somewhere. John makes just some brief comments about Second Corinthians, but one of the things that I have always felt about Second Corinthians is that it might be one of the least known books of the New Testament. It just doesn't seem to be a book that, a lot of churches, take people through in terms of their teaching. And yet it contains some really significant texts there in Second Corinthians. And I'll try and kind of give you a little bit of more than what's in The Road to Somewhere. Remember in First Corinthians that one of the big issues in First Corinthians had to do with, remember, problems and questions, and it was a city that was just situated in a way that it was kind of like the sin city of the ancient world. And one of the things that was going on there was that there was a man that was involved in an affair, actually with his mother-in-law, and Paul was just quite upset when he heard about this, and actually told the church they should excommunicate this guy. In other words, put him outside of the fellowship. And I think that's where he uses the expression for the destruction of his flesh, almost like being inside the church community gives us a degree of protection against spiritual warfare, and that by excommunicating him or setting him outside the fellowship of the church, he was open to a certain degree of spiritual warfare. But now what Paul does, and this is one of the main purposes early on in the letter, is he actually tells them that they should bring him back in, that the punishment that had been inflicted on him, we can see here in the second chapter of the book, was sufficient. And now that they should actually, forgive him and comfort him and bring him back into the fellowship. So that was really kind of one of the major reasons that he wrote Second Corinthians. But of course, he went on from there. One of the things that happens, and we see this in many of Paul's letters, is that there was a group, usually considered to be coming out of Jerusalem, that were Jewish, and we think believers, but they oftentimes would go to places where Paul had been and where Paul had preached a message of grace and salvation through faith in Christ alone. And they began to give the message, first of all, that was not adequate, and that along with faith in Christ, that people, men particularly, needed to be circumcised, and that both men and women needed to follow the law of Moses. And they became known as Judaizers. And basically what they were saying is that along with faith in Christ and what he had accomplished on the cross, you needed to become a Jew. And Paul really was very upset whenever someone came along and gave this message. So part of what happens in Second Corinthians is that he challenges them again. This is going to happen in a lot of his letters. We're going to see that particularly next week, I think, in the book of Galatians in our next session. And the second issue that he was dealing with is, along with them saying that his message was not sufficient, they also were saying that he wasn't a true apostle because he had not actually seen physically the risen Christ, which was one of the requirements for apostleship. And they discounted his experience on the Damascus Road when the glorified Christ actually appeared to Paul, and Paul had his conversion experience and then went into Damascus. He'd been blinded by that experience. And of course, they send one of the believers to Paul there in Damascus, who prays for him, baptizes him, and Paul gets his sight back. And Paul, who had been a persecutor, really becomes, one of the primary apostles of the early church. So that gets addressed in the letter also. And what Paul does to sort of build a case throughout the letter of the validity of his apostleship is that he talks a lot about what he has suffered as an apostle and as ministering and telling people about Christ and establishing churches. This letter was probably written on his third missionary journey, so many years have transpired where he has been across both the area of where he kind of based out of there in Antioch, up in Syria, basically, and had gone throughout Asia Minor and had established churches on his first journey through Galatia. Anyway, he talks about all of these things that he has suffered, which are part of what his argument is for the validity of his apostleship. What happens because of that is that Second Corinthians is probably the most personal letter in the New Testament where we learn about the Apostle Paul. It's not like Romans, which is just filled with sort of a very logical flow of doctrine that he lays out when he writes Romans. This is a personal letter. The structure of it doesn't really lend itself to teaching in a very chronological kind of an order. But we do get so much of who Paul was and what it cost him to be an apostle. But he uses that then to teach a very important message, and we'll talk about that in just a second. I want to just say that, again, in the book, it doesn't go into all of this, but I wanted to hit with you just three highlights from the book of Second Corinthians. And I just really encourage you. I watched the video this week and the longer teaching video, and it's really packed. I actually went over my time limit when I taught it and had to ask the audience if they would give me an extra 5 minutes just to finish up the book. So there's a lot of content, and I encourage you to take the time to watch that. You have a link to it in your email. One of the highlights that he talks about, and I really have found this personally encouraging, is he talks about the power of weakness. He makes mention of the fact that we are like jars of clay, and that it's the weakness of our humanness that really enables us to tap into the power of God's strength. And so you have texts like this one in 2 Corinthians 12, where he talks about that he actually delights in weaknesses and insults and hardships and difficulties. And then he makes this great statement: for when I am weak, then I am strong. So that's a big message and a highlight of the book. By the way, this takes place, these statements in chapter 12, after he's had an actual experience of being caught up into heaven and seeing this heavenly scene, what that reality was. It probably ties back in to what happened in the book of Acts. He talks about it being 14 years prior to that. I probably have some text here. I'm a little bit ahead of myself. So let me just hold on to that for a second and let me highlight what I think, kind of talk about what I think is the second highlight. Along with the power of weakness, this is a book that talks about what happens when we die. And the fifth chapter of 2 Corinthians has a very powerful little passage in it where he uses the metaphor that our body is like a tent that we dwell in. And when we die, it's as if we leave that tent. And then he talks about that when we are in that tent, or when we're in the body, that we are away from the Lord, but that when we die physically and that we are away from the body, then we immediately enter into the presence of the Lord and are at home with him. And he again reiterates that that would be the preferable situation. So his understanding of death is quite different. I happen to think that probably what happened when he got caught up into the heavenly realms and had an experience of what comes after this life, that's part of the reason that he could make these kind of statements. Like in Philippians, when we get there and we see where he talks about that he desires to depart and be with Christ, which is better by far. So anyway, that's another one of the highlights of 2 Corinthians. And then the third one is this experience that he has where he talks about being caught up and having seen something of this heavenly realm. 14 years earlier, he says, is when that happened. And we think that that was probably on his first missionary journey. In that journey, you might remember in Acts chapter 14, he's in the little town of Lystra in Galatia, and they stone him, believing that he is dead, and drag him out of town and leave him for dead. And then we're just told that he gets up and and walks away. And there is some speculation that it was during that experience of being stoned and left for dead that perhaps he actually had this vision of the heavenly realm, and that would tie into, by the way, all of the different hardships that he's been talking about through the book. So Second Corinthians, again, not well known perhaps, but again, filled with some very important theology and texts as you go through there. So I hope you will take time to watch the longer video. In the book, after John has given, again, a little bit of an explanation of Second Corinthians, and they kind of come to the close of this stop, they decide that it's time to head down the road. Joy decides she's going to drive the car. John is trying to avoid the information that he gave her in our last episode about his true background, and that eventually is going to become a major point of discussion in the storyline of the book. And now they're going to head about 40 miles down the road on Route 66, and they'll come to the town of Flagstaff. And there in Flagstaff, they're going to shoot the video, and the book that will be attached to that is what I think is one of the most important books in the New Testament, much different than Second Corinthians, very systematic, almost like a miniature version of the book of Romans, and that's the book of Galatians. So we'll tackle that. We'll head to Flagstaff, and we'll look at Galatians in our next session together. So thanks for tuning in. And again, let me just encourage you to watch that longer teaching video, and we'll look forward to being with you again in our next session.